With preventable illness on the rise, Chronic Disease Day is an opportunity to reevaluate what we can all do individually and also as a country to lower the number of preventable illnesses and increase support to those with unpreventable conditions. We're proud to bring together a broad coalition of national advocacy groups and the support of leaders from the National Institutes of Health and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to promote everyday wellness and caregiving for ourselves and each other to build a healthier community. Governors and mayors from Albuquerque to Chicago to Honolulu issued official proclamations in recognition of our work together. Landmarks and bridges across the country lit up to show their support. And our grassroots community let the world know who they stay strong for in their fight against chronic illness. This year, Chronic Disease Day also celebrates the national leaders who are making a positive difference on behalf of the entire chronic disease community.
Well, I'm really honored. So often we pass legislation, but it's not necessarily recognized by the communities that we hope to serve. This is really meaningful to me. I have a chronic condition. We've had, co-pays or something that I was certainly aware of as a child related to my chronic condition. And I knew that in coming into this job that we would have an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of people. And healthcare is such a concern because of the high cost. And so I'm just grateful to be able to partner with you all and recognizing the shared bond that we have.
You honor me in a way that is hard for me to believe it is deserving, but you really honor Len Rogers and more importantly, hopefully, in honoring his legacy, inspire more people to be like him. And to the degree that I get to be part of that, that's just a blessing for me. It really is. So thank you so much for this. This means the world to me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Dwally, and I am the president of Good Days, a national 501c3 nonprofit patient assistance and advocacy organization that makes life-saving and life-extending treatments accessible. Thank you for joining us at our signature chronic disease livestream event. We have an excellent lineup of speakers today, beginning with a panel discussion led by Julia Savakul, the executive editor of HealthCentral. Hello, Julia, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I would like to introduce our panel for today's conversation. We are meeting with Dr. Vail Wright, who is the Senior Director of Healthcare Innovation at the American Psychological Association. She's a clinical psychologist, a researcher, and a spokesperson for the APA. She has been interviewed many times in television, radio, print, and online media by CNN, NBC News, The Washington Post, NPR, and many others. Her expertise range from topics of stress, politics, serious mental illness, telehealth and technology, and access to mental health care. We also have with us today Sabrina Skiles, a longtime contributor to HealthCentral. She is a lifestyle and psoriasis blogger who is also diagnosed with breast cancer just 2 years after her 35th birthday. She has a blog, Homegrown Houston, which is a lifestyle resource for millennial women and those living with chronic conditions. She shares daily inspiration from health and wellness, motherhood and marriage to managing a chronic disease while living a stylish life. Sabrina is also a social ambassador for the National Psoriasis Foundation, and you can find her sharing her hashtag #ChemoLife and psoriasis tips on her Instagram at Sabrina Skiles. And finally, we have Mandy Patterson. She is a patient expert and an advocate for ulcerative colitis and inflammatory bowel disease. She started down the road to advocacy after receiving her ulcerative colitis diagnosis in 2013 and experiencing complications with UC since 2010. She's a full-time technical writer and a technical writing instructor for Missouri State University. She is a BA and MA in professional writing, and for her master's thesis, she wrote about the quality of patient education materials for those diagnosed with UC and the need for technical writers in the IBD medical field. She's a social ambassador for IBD, HealthCentral's Facebook page, and I'm so excited to have all three of you here with me today. And As Clarenda said, I am the executive editor for HealthCentral, which is a health and wellness website with a focus on people who have chronic conditions. So let me just jump right into it, guys. We are a year and a half out from the COVID crisis in the US. And what I really wanted to talk with you all today about is the state of chronic care and mental health in a post-COVID world. We're sort of on the cusp of coming out of COVID, but it certainly has had a dramatic impact on our chronic community for the last year and a half. So if I could start by asking Sabrina and Mandy, maybe Mandy, I could start with you. Just tell us a little bit about how your treatment for UC was affected by COVID, what some of the biggest concerns you had when the pandemic started, and how that sort of played out over the last year and a half.
Yeah, I think for me, once everything kind of started and we went into lockdown, it was a lot of paranoia that set in, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of stress. I had just gone in December for my biannual colonoscopy, and I had a follow-up scheduled in March, like very early March. And I was like, I don't know that I need to go into the office to do that. Something about like being in that space with that many other people and not knowing the degree of seriousness that other folks were kind of taking weirded me out. So I think with that, and then also kind of in the very beginning, I went on antibiotics for an ear infection, which caused my UC to flare up. And living in downtown Chicago at the time, it was like, I was talking to my doctor and they're like, take an Uber and go get a blood test and stool test. And I was like, no. And they're like, well, you can always walk. And I'm like, no. So there was a lot of, I think, really difficult decisions to make in the beginning of what care do I absolutely need to have? And can I do that virtually? Or does it absolutely have to be in person? So I think that was really what I grappled with, was making those calls to keep myself safe, but to also keep my UC in check.
Sure, and with a lot of the tests you need for UC, like you said, a colonoscopy, it's not, with something like Sabrina with psoriasis, I think maybe there might be more leeway with telehealth and be able to show a doctor your skin, virtually, versus you can't really have a virtual colonoscopy that I know of anyways. So would you say that it was, sort of throughout the pandemic, that kind of concern or caution, or did your feelings change over time?
I think as we got closer to the point where we're at now, I'm definitely a lot more comfortable going in person. It also made me feel a lot better that for my colonoscopy, I was required to have a COVID test prior, as was everyone else getting a colonoscopy. And that had to be 3 days before. So that made me feel really good. The reduced staff, everyone had masks on. So knowing that my provider was taking the precautions that they needed to helped me to feel a lot more secure in making sure that I was going through with some of my care in person. I think now I'm fully vaccinated. I feel a little bit more comfortable, but it definitely took a while to get back to that point.
Sabrina, let me add you in here. You are the master of chronic conditions. Not only do you have psoriasis, but you've also done battle with breast cancer. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were at with your treatments as COVID hit last year, and what it was like for you going through that period?
Yeah, so I've been living with psoriasis for 20 years, and I feel like I got comfortable going into the office and, doing all my precautions. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in August of 2019. So before the pandemic and everything. So I was at the point where I was like, okay, my immune system is lowered. I know I'm going to be needing chemo. I know I'm going to be needing radiation. So I was already starting to get in that mindset of being extra vigilant about hand washing and where I was taking my kids and where I was going. So I think I was already in my mindset, and my family and my close friends were already kind of in that mindset. Okay, we need to be extra careful around her. So I did my first round of chemo in Houston, and this was before the pandemic. And, you know, I felt comfortable because I was already in that mindset, and people are already like that with somebody going through chemo and cancer. They're already extra vigilant. But then when I got here to Denver in the middle of the move, we hit stay-at-home orders the day I needed radiation. So I had to carry a letter with me from my doctor that said, I'm receiving treatment at the cancer center. I need to be on the roads in case I got pulled over or whatever, that I would have to show the cops. You know, that never happened, but I was like, oh my God, this is surreal, because this is just like what I've been dealing with for 6 months. And there are people who've been dealing with this their entire life. So to add this like extra layer of caution that I needed. And then, you know, like Mandy was saying, it made me realize what care I actually needed, what I needed from my family, what care I needed for my kids. Is this necessary? You know, is it just a fever? Is it this? Is it more than that? It's something that can be telehealth. Probably before COVID, I wouldn't have just maybe done telehealth for like a very mild fever with my kid. But because that was going on, I was like, okay, we can scale it back a little and then kind of see what happens from there. But, you know, it just, it made us realize like what we really needed. And then I think it really changed the mindset and the perspective of everybody else. Like, okay, well, we have to be this way now, but people who are living with chronic conditions have to be like this all the time. So I think it's starting to change now, hopefully, and people are starting to realize what we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
That is exactly what I want to get to in just a minute, because I feel like there's a real sort of crossover between the lives you guys have adapted to and grappled with and sort of come out on top of for so long, and that, you know, this 15 months of all these restrictions on the rest of the population is suddenly like a little bit of a wake up to what it is like to have a chronic condition and have to be so hyper vigilant all the time. But before we go there, let me just bring in Dr. Wright, because along with the logistics of dealing with a chronic condition during the pandemic, I wanted to get your perspective on sort of the mental health aspect of that and how something so huge and unknown like COVID can do a real number on people who already have a full plate of challenges that they're grappling with. Did you see during this time, you know, in your community or as a psychologist, an increase in mental health issues in the chronic community, or, you know, obviously in general, everybody's under a whole new layer of stress, but for people who are already stressed, how did that play out?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And first, I want to thank you for inviting me and APA to be a part of this panel and to talk about the roles that mental health plays with our physical chronic health conditions as well. I think that's really critical, and to be able to be here with Mandy and Sabrina is really amazing. So thank you. I think that it was a little bit of both when we saw the response to mental health. I think, to Sabrina's point, there was probably a group of individuals who actually felt validated by this experience and sort of that feeling of now everybody else gets it too. And because they, as we talked about, have a tendency to have to stay vigilant, as long as that didn't cross over into hypervigilance, right, where everything feels like a threat and it becomes impossible to make really strong decisions, then I think they probably did okay. I think there's definitely a group that felt overwhelmed in terms of their coping strategies and mechanisms. And it's not just that it was the pandemic and the potential that COVID could impact their chronic illness, but it's all the other things on top of that, right? So for example, most chronic illnesses, or many, they're invisible to others. And so people might not understand why you're making more conservative choices than others. And what we saw over the last year and a half is just an unprecedented level of judgment about decisions that people were making, you know, about what they felt was safe and not safe. And so I think that probably added an extra layer, in addition to the disruptions that we saw, disruptions to work, to school, to routines. And routines are particularly important for everybody because they provide stability. But I think for someone with a chronic health condition, it becomes even more important because it really helps, again, provide structure to how you maintain your physical health just on a day-to-day basis. So with all of those things going on, we always say nobody was immune to the COVID situation, the pandemic, but everybody had to experience it a little bit differently. And I think for those with chronic health conditions, it was just an added layer of additional stress and uncertainty. And so that often can have negative effects.
Do you maybe, and Sabrina, the idea of validation a little bit, is that something that sort of crossed your mind during the last year and a half of COVID?
Absolutely. I even had friends saying, well, weren't you already doing all these things? Yeah, I was. And I think for me, it was also, it gave me it gave me an opportunity to teach my kids how to be extra, just clean around, especially going to school and going to the grocery store. And even now we still wear masks because the kids still have to wear masks. So for me as a parent, I'm still modeling that behavior for my kids. Even though I'm fully vaccinated, they don't really understand, like, yeah, mommy got a shot and she's healthy now, but the kids still don't. So for me, and it's just like what Dr. Wright was saying, we have to be respectful of everybody else's choices. So we don't know what their story is. We don't know if they have a chronic condition, if they're going through cancer or chemo. So I think for everybody to respect, why is she wearing masks? The COVID's over. It's not really over for people battling chronic conditions. So for me, I'm trying to stay respectful for myself, my family, and for others living with a chronic condition too.
Do you have a similar feeling to that, Mandy, or what do you think in terms of other people finally getting what it is like to be to infection, to disease, to contact with other people with a sensitive immune system?
Yeah, I think for a lot of us that have IBD, when you first get diagnosed, it's this sense of like, why me? Like, what did I do? We don't know what causes IBD. There's no cure for IBD. You just drew the card, right? And I think for this pandemic, it was a lot of like, can I get it? What is my risk? I feel like, especially too with IBD, there's a lot of times where I'm like, I'm not going to go to this social event. I'm not going to go to this other thing. I'm not going to see people, one, because I don't feel good and I have to kind of protect my physical health, but also mental health. It can be super overwhelming. And I think that validation came knowing that other larger unaffected groups also had to kind of go through that. I feel like there's a bit more kind of, maybe not as much sympathy anymore, but a little bit more empathy, which I think is what these kind of chronic disease groups, like what we all kind of band together around, is that connection, that empathy that you get from people who have been there, who have gotten it. So to know that like larger populations have now kind of gotten to peek behind the curtain a little bit and understand those same kinds of moments where you have to make a call to not only protect your physical well-being, but your mental well-being. I've just seen kind of an increase in empathy and people kind of getting it. I'm not getting hit with as much of like, there goes Mandy bailing again. I think it's kind of this understood thing. Like, I have to do what's best for me in that moment to protect myself and the ones around me. So I think that camaraderie aspect has kind of been one of the positives of the pandemic. Not that there have been many, but to know that there's kind of this communal sense of like, yeah, I get it now, I think has made me feel better in some of the choices that I've made.
Yeah, I feel like there's a sense with COVID, there was a sense like everybody's in it together. And I guess like one of the primary ways COVID is different than having a chronic condition is that, as you said, you were sort of just dealt a card. With COVID, there are some very real measures everybody could take to trying to not get that card. Whereas with you and with Sabrina, it was sort of like, here, you've got this, now deal. And with COVID, it was kind of like, if you do certain things, you might not have to deal. So I guess that's probably, one of the big differences with that. If I could just sort of turn this back to Dr. Wright for a minute, the idea that, that you're locked inside for a year and a half, or at least for a year for many people, with very limited contact, with very few options for socializing. We've all read the stories about the increase in depression and domestic violence problems and anxiety. And so with your community of therapists, how during this time, like what did you do to try to reach those people who were most isolated because of the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the data over the last year and a half has been really consistent. Again, nobody has been immune to COVID, but certain groups certainly have been disproportionately impacted compared to others. And the 4 groups that we've seen that have been the most vulnerable are parents with children under the age of 18, particularly at the start of the pandemic, were reporting really high levels of stress as they transitioned to e-learning. Individuals from communities of color, young adults, so individuals under the age of, say, 22, as well as frontline and essential workers. And so all of the reasons why they were disproportionately stressed and impacted differ slightly. So, interventions really sort of depend on which group you're working with. But we know we had lots of psychologists, particularly inside hospital systems, that were setting up support networks for the frontline medical workers to really help them cope with just the daily trauma that they were seeing. You were transporting nurses who maybe work in dermatology to suddenly be in the ICU. And how do you actually make that kind of transition when that's not the kind of work you typically do day to day? So that's some of the things that we were seeing. And then, of course, a real pivot towards telehealth. We found that back in October, almost 96% of the psychologists we spoke to had done at least some, if not all, of their therapy via telehealth. And so that really provided an important continuity of care, both for those that were already in therapy and then, of course, needed additional therapy, but new people, new individuals seeking out therapy for maybe even the first time were able to access that care pretty seamlessly. Of course, nothing's entirely seamless or without barriers, but telehealth does lend itself pretty well to mental health care. And so those are some of the things that we were seeing, is people really wanting to reach out. I think one of the challenges with younger adults, and this speaks to a bit of what Mandy was saying, is that during the height of COVID, individuals weren't taking their children to preventative care settings to see their primary care or their pediatricians. And that's where a lot of the mental health conditions and issues actually get screened and identified and then referred out. So I think we're going to be seeing ripple effects from COVID, not just the isolation and the COVID itself, but all the other ways in which we were impacted, whether it's the economy and the racial unrest that's occurring, that's just going to have mental health impacts probably on our communities for a long time coming.
And when you talk about those screenings, it makes me think of Sabrina also with breast cancer, the statistics early on in the pandemic. I think the numbers have evened out somewhat at this point, but the number of people who simply didn't go for screenings for various conditions, including breast cancer, and I think all of us wonder what that is going to look like in another year from now when somebody who could have been caught, in stage 1 or stage 2 has a much more aggressive form of cancer at this point. Is that something, in some ways, I suppose you were fortunate to find out about your situation, 6 months before all heck broke loose.
Yeah, I think that's been, I think that's a real worry for a lot of women. And, it would have been for me as well, had I not found the lump myself. So I think now we need to just revitalize this conversation, even just around breast health, or making sure we are knowing our own bodies, because we know our bodies the best. And if we feel like something isn't right, then say something. And we need to really just be able to speak up for ourselves. And because that's where, if we are missing our mammograms, or if they're pushed back, a month or whatever due to whatever happens in the hospital, I think it's really important for us to stay vigilant and really just understand what our bodies are now, so that we know what our normal looks like in case something not normal shows up, and then we're able to really just speak up for ourselves.
Mandy, with you see the ability to use virtual care seems, as I said before, particularly challenging, or has some particular challenges to it. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've navigated that, and at this point, what your advice would be to other UC patients as far as what's okay to do virtually versus what situations where you feel like it is an in-person visit requirement?
Yeah, definitely. I think it ties in perfectly, Sabrina, to what you said, that as an IBD patient, you have to know your body. You have to know what your new kind of normal is. And I think in those moments where, for me, if I've had a bit of a deviation from normal, those are the times I'm usually just shooting my GI a message over my chart, and she gets back to me, and we have really good communication that way. And there is always the option for telehealth with my GI. What I would say for other, not even just UC patients, not even just IBD patients, is exactly like Sabrina said, know your normal. And if your deviation from that normal is a bit more intense, for me, like, I deal with chronic constipation with my UC. So kind of the opposite of what a lot of people think that IBD is. But for me, if my BMs are increasing to like 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day, like that's when I know, okay, it's time to reach out. And I go with my doctor's recommendation. Do I need to come in? Is there any kind of like stopgap we can put into place in the meantime so I can maybe reduce my exposure to coming into the hospital and seeing her that way? But I would always just recommend to kind of find that new normal and always ask for that advice. And if you're in a situation where a medical care provider is not responding quickly and not giving you the advice that you need when you need it, that might be a time to start considering other care options or other providers. Especially with chronic illness, you need someone that, maybe they're not responding right away, but they're not going to take, 2, 3, 4 business days to get back to you. I think just kind of staying on top of it, keeping an eye on it, like Sabrina said, and just really knowing kind of where you're at. I think that has been the best way that I've navigated to say, this deviation from my normal is too great. I'm going to rely on my medical team to tell me the best advice and my best next step rather than kind of making a call on my own.
Do you feel like often we talk about how stress is a exacerbator of symptoms for a whole host of conditions, or for just about any condition, I guess. Do you feel like the stress of the last year and a half has made it harder to deal with the symptoms of UC, or is it something that you just kind of kept rolling with?
I will say it did make it harder, especially knowing that I had a colonoscopy coming up, blood work, stool samples, all of that kind of stuff. I also have like a phenomenal psychiatrist. So that really helped in tapping into like mental health resources to get through that. It definitely added, I feel like colonoscopies are always stressful for me. So adding this additional layer of like, oh, now you have to go get COVID tested 3 days before, plus do the colonoscopy prep, plus, normally my husband is there through the whole appointment with me and in recovery. And to know that I was going into that alone felt very, very daunting for me. But being able to talk through it with not only my psychiatrist, but friends and family, that really helps. So I think the more I talk and the more I can kind of get that empathy, the camaraderie, the stress tends to go down and the symptoms kind of come down with it.
Dr. Wright, when Mandy is saying about the element here of not being able to bring your most intimate support systems with you to your appointments or to help you go through some of the things you need to go through with chronic conditions, that sort of throws a whole nother aspect of uncertainty, of anxiety into the mix. I know we just interviewed you for a piece for HealthCentral where you talk a lot about how uncertainty is sort of what's behind or what is driving a lot of the anxiety around COVID and in the last year and a half. What can people with chronic conditions do in situations like that to try to get the upper hand on the situation?
Yeah, thanks. And uncertainty is an interesting thing because it actually operates on a continuum. So some people really can tolerate a fair amount of uncertainty because they can identify the things that are in their control and they kind of let go of the rest. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have individuals that really have a hard time tolerating uncertainty. And that's normal. We as humans, we like things to be predictable. So really the path forward is to identify those things that are in your control and try to let go of the things that aren't. So an example would be, you really don't have control over whether other people who are vaccinated or unvaccinated wear their masks, right? That's just not something that we can have control over. But we can sort of decide what are the small steps or what sorts of risk am I willing to put myself at as we continue to emerge into the community. We all put ourselves at risk every single day when we get into a car, and somehow we've decided that that that's a risk worth taking. So it is just about kind of having talks and communications with your family members and those around you about what makes sense for you and your family based on both, your own personal situation as well as the community and where you live become important factors. So really focusing on our control. And I like Mandy's point about social connection, because we know that social connection is one of the huge buffers to stress. And so making sure that we're finding ways to maintain those social connections become really important, especially over the last year and a half where we've been so isolated. So how can we maintain some of those creative ways that we've connected to others going forward? And then again, it's about sort of taking a non-judgmental and practicing grace with yourself going forward. I think this year has been unbelievably stressful, and we sort of need to be okay with not being okay, even now. I hear a lot of people saying, shouldn't I just be really happy that things are reopening and that people are getting vaccinated, and I've gotten vaccinated, shouldn't I feel safer? And the reality is maybe, but not all the time. It's really normal to have a variety of mixed feelings right now, including fear or sort of trepidation. In our most recent APA survey, we found that about 50% of adults, even if they had been vaccinated, reported some discomfort with reentry. So it's really very common to not feel as okay as you wish you were feeling right now, and to give yourself permission to just not feel that great yet, and to just take it day by day.
First of all, Mandy and Sabrina have been, when Dr. Wright mentions the importance of community and support systems, they have been pillars of the HealthCentral community and our Facebook channels, and reaching out to other people with conditions like theirs to let everybody know that we are all part of a group and we're in this together, which has been awesome in the last year. With Sabrina, when you were talking about with your kids, and that they still need to wear masks, and trying to explain to them sort of why that is and what's going on, and mommy got a shot. And what are your feelings about as we sort of move back into more quote unquote normal living? But there are certain groups, whether it's kids or whether it's people who are immunocompromised, who are still super careful and cautious about what they're doing. Do you feel like you are now even more aware than you were before of certain health safety protocols, or are you feeling comfortable moving back to 2019?
I think I'm more aware, even more aware than I was before, because I not only need to be aware for myself, but for my kids as well, because they're still trying to process a lot of things. They went through e-learning, and do I go back to school? Do we need masks? They want to share everything, but now we need to teach them, not to share things. And like the parks were closed, and for them seeing like tape around the parks where they would go all the time, that was really hard. Even, for my young one who was 3.5 at the time, I want to go to the park. Why can't I go? So trying to explain those things was difficult. And I had multiple conversations with my therapist on how to explain those things to my children. So I think it's really important to understand that, even when you do have kids, it makes you see the world in a completely different place. And I think it made me open my eyes. Even though I was going through chemo, it made me open my eyes to, this is only maybe 6 to 9 months of my life, but then there's going to be so many more people going through this. So I think it's making us more aware and being more, like Mandy was saying, more empathy, and just really understanding that even though you feel like the world is getting back to and things are opening up, it's still going to be a lot slower for us possibly. So empathy is going to be our saving grace.
Mandy, I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but is it frustrating at all, this sense of like everybody else is like, woohoo, COVID's over, got shot, moving on, and some of us are a little bit slow to that party? Is it mostly a feeling of relief that things seem to be getting better, or is there some frustration that you feel that you are not as free to indulge in that as other people might be?
Yeah, I definitely, I think after I got vaccinated, my husband got vaccinated, or friends, family, that kind of was like, okay, got one less thing that I need to be on top of and worried about. I think like the time between my first and second shot, I was like, I just want the second shot. Like, can I get it faster? Because I need to not worry about this anymore. So that's been good. But there is, I think, especially in the IBD community that I've seen of this, like, wouldn't it be really cool if we could just get a shot and be done?
Yeah.
And not have to worry about it anymore. And I know a lot also in that same community that might be on TPN or EEN to help treat any flare-ups or anything like that, or, you know, even going for infusions for biologics, those types of things. There's still this trepidation. There's still this, yeah, I'm vaccinated, but I just don't know. And I think, like Dr. Wright, you said, we have no control over who gets vaccinated and wears a mask and who doesn't. And there's still kind of, I think, this additional thing that still has to be worried about on our part. So not only, I think, you know, the vaccine makes you feel a little bit better. It is one less thing to worry about. But I think those of us in the chronic illness community, yeah, we don't have to worry about it maybe as much as we did, but it is still kind of at the forefront of our minds. And I think a little bit of that freedom, that little bit of life goes back to normal isn't as prevalent for us as it might be for other folks who are outside of that kind of chronic community.
What do you make, Dr. Wright, of the people who aren't chronic, who are seemingly otherwise quite healthy and yet are still seem very anxious and nervous, having gotten the shot, having been vaccinated, but it's like something went off in our brains in the last year and a half where, you know, like when you get on the New York City subway now, everybody's got their masks on, but even so, it's a little bit uncomfortable, and it's a weird thing that happens in our minds. What is that?
Yeah, I mean, for the last year and a half, we've been told that if we do certain things that we're going to catch COVID and potentially die. That's some pretty heavy messaging. And while it was accurate and true, when you live under that level of threat for such a long period of time, it's going to be an adjustment to rework your mindset to being like, oh, okay, so now it's sort of safe to do these things again because people have been making ideally good decisions. And I think the rapidity with which things happened on both ends was really shocking, right? It was like overnight we went to lockdown. And then it almost felt like overnight we went to, oh, now you can take your masks off if you're vaccinated. And I just think our brains just haven't quite caught up yet. Transitions take time. They can be really uncomfortable. And again, there could be lots of reasons why people still feel uncomfortable. You might have children home under the age of 12 that aren't eligible to get vaccinated yet. And so you need to take that into consideration as people move forward. You could, again, have a chronic illness that really sort of is still underlying a lot of the anxiety that's going on. Plus, there's still that level of uncertainty. Yes, we have multiple vaccines. I used to say 3, but now I was a little hesitant to say 3. We have multiple vaccines that seem to be effective, but we still don't know that much about the variants. We don't know that much about boosters. So I think there's still just a lot of uncertainty, and we need to, again, just kind of give ourselves time and space in order to, sort of slowly move back to however we want things to look going forward. Because I think that's the other part is nothing's going to look quite the same ever again, right? We don't exactly know how healthcare and education and retail and these other spaces are going to look different, but we know that they will look different. And so how do we navigate this new world where hopefully we can hold on to the things that we've gained as well? I mean, I know we focus a lot on what's been lost over the year and a half for good reason, but I think there have been huge gains in terms of how we think about work and working from home and how we think about healthcare and how we prioritize family and what we really value. So how do we hold on to those things going forward as well? It's a lot of cognitive load and it's a lot of emotional load for people to take on still.
I think, what you're saying about the uncertainties sort of driving a lot of the mental health issues in the last year. And even though it's a positive uncertainty in the way that, we're exiting COVID, it's still, you don't know, as you say, you don't know exactly what's next. And when, as you also say, with people with chronic conditions where routine and familiarity and a sort of set pattern of knowing what each day holds is important, I think it can, anxiety lingers even as COVID leaves, I guess. If I could ask all of you one by one, a final question for this panel. What is the one thing that living through COVID has taught you about yourself, has maybe surprised you, or has given you a greater awareness of yourself and your health in the last year? Sabrina, I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, I love this question because for me, I think it taught me that I am resilient, as we've heard that word so many times. I think it means a lot more to those of us in the chronic community. And I think that we're a lot stronger than we give ourselves credit for. And because I feel like we've battled this so many times before COVID hit, but then we were just thrown this on top of everything else. I think it made us stronger, and I think it made us feel that we could speak up for ourselves and people would really understand, instead of saying, "Oh, really? You don't look like you have a chronic condition." So I think it really has made us stronger, and I think it's given us just more awareness for others around us, and not to judge a book by its cover, because you never know what somebody is going through.
Amen to that. Mandy, what would you add to that perfect answer?
It's really hard to add to that. The first word that kind of popped in my mind too, Sabrina, was resilience. I think going through this whole experience, I think for myself, it was realizing I need people more than I thought I did. I'm a little bit of that like introverted extrovert, only child. I'm like, I got this. But I think in times like this, and especially when you are part of that chronic community, having connection, having other people being able to reach out, whether it's FaceTime, a phone call. I took so many phone calls, and I used to be like, oh, the phone's ringing, can't do it. But I think just knowing that we are warriors in our own sense, all of us that have gone through this, whether you're in the chronic community or not, I think that strength that emerged, that resilience, and kind of seeing community pop up more, I think, than ever. And that kind of longing for, yes, in-person connection, but knowing that we could find really creative ways to have that connection outside of being, in the same room together. I think that was one of the things that I treasured the most. I spent time with friends that I never get to see in person anyway. So that was just a really, I think, kind of special thing about all of this, was seeing that resilience, not only in myself, but with the community that I surround myself with.
And Dr. Wright, let's finish with you. What is the last year and a half of COVID taught you about yourself, or about being a psychologist?
I think for me, it's really been a catalyst or a disruptor to reprioritizing what I value. I think that I've really put a lot of time and effort and value into my identity as a psychologist and my career. And I think that's important, but it's not the most important thing for me anymore. I think it's really more about family, and really making sure that I prioritize family over everything else. And that includes protecting my time, like in the evenings when it's meant to be quality time, and not accepting, always saying yes to everything I'm asked to do. And so that's been a little hard and challenging, but also really rewarding. I came to family relatively late. I got married in October during COVID in my backyard, and became a stepmother all at the same time. So I think for me, it's been a hard but beautiful year. And so I think, like I mentioned before, I really think holding on to what we value going forward, and that recognition, I think, is going to be really critical. And I hope that we continue to do that as part of our path towards resilience.
Well, speaking of being protective of your time, I really appreciate all three of you making time today to be part of this panel. Along with Good Days, we are so excited to bring awareness to chronic health conditions and to bring awareness to National Chronic Disease Day. So thanks everybody for joining. And if anybody has any questions, please post them on our Facebook page, and we will get back to you with answers from our panel.
Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Karen Hacker, who is the director of the CDC's National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. Thank you, Dr. Hacker, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited. So our audience will certainly be interested in hearing some answers to some questions that we've put together for you. So let's get started. How does the CDC address social determinants of health and work towards health equity?
So I'm really excited to be able to talk about social determinants. It is a passion of mine. But first, let me just make sure everyone knows what social determinants are. These are the positive and negative conditions in the places where people live, learn, work, and play that can affect a wide range of health and quality of life risks and outcomes. We definitely know that where you live makes a big difference in how long you live, how healthy you are, if you've got access to things that will help you become healthy, such as healthy foods, good economy, built environment, things like that. And social determinants often impact the opportunities that you have to make healthy choices and practice healthy behaviors. So we are working on a whole variety of areas. And in our chronic disease center, we are particularly focusing on 5 areas that we think are very important, particularly for chronic disease. And those social determinants include food insecurity, social connectedness, community clinical linkages, tobacco-free policies, and the built environment. And we recognize that the essential role that measurement and data collection and surveillance systems play in enabling healthy lives in healthy communities. But we also want to make sure that people recognize that community engagement and collaboration is at the core of addressing social determinants of health. At the local level, advocacy groups are encouraged to make connections and to push for data sharing, collaborative strategizing, and collective action to get the job done. For example, our CDC Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health, or the REACH program, is an example of some of the work that we're doing in communities. Through the REACH program, CDC funds 31 organizations, coalitions, and diverse partnerships in 21 states to address social determinants of health in their communities. They prioritize those most at risk for chronic disease and health inequities, and then they implement a variety of culturally tailored programs ranging from tobacco policies to various built environments like building bike paths and walking trails and things like that. And we're also working with the Association of State and Territorial Health Officers and the National Association of City and County Health Officials to assess the work of 42 coalitions that are currently actively engaging in social determinant of health work. We're going to be supporting community health workers in a brand new notice of funding opportunity that's currently being determined right now. And that's going to be over $300 million to jurisdictions this summer for community health workers to support the COVID-19 prevention and control efforts, and some for also training, technical assistance, and evaluation. So there's a lot going on right now.
Well, we certainly appreciate all the work, and I can tell you that we've used CDC data to try to get a better understanding of programs that we can create that not only help the community, but impact the preventable illness. So trying to do things to get food to people who need food, healthy food, bringing exercise routines that can help as well. And you brought up something about COVID. So my next question is, how has COVID-19 impacted chronic disease?
Well, I'm sure you are aware that COVID-19 has really unequally impacted a variety of individuals. For example, people of color in certain communities where there were already existing health inequities have seen unbelievable negative effects. And in some ways, social determinants are at the root cause of some of this.
Right.
Chronic diseases, we also know, are a major risk factor for becoming severely ill from COVID-19 and from dying from COVID-19. And so we know that these populations have really been disproportionately impacted by both chronic disease and COVID-19. So based on a recent study, nearly 65,000 patients with COVID-19 had pre-existing chronic conditions, and they were significantly associated with an increased odds of in-hospital mortality, like metastatic solid tumors had a 57% increase, a history of a myocardial infarction or a heart attack had a 47% increase, congestive heart failure, 37% increase, diabetes, 20% increase, and I could go on. We also know that some of the limited studies that found that there were differences between racial and ethnic groups in the health and social factors that might increase the risk of severe illness or death from COVID-19. Those could include where you work, whether you could really do the mitigation strategies, how many people lived in your house, those kinds of things. During the pandemic, we also know that habits have changed. People refer to the COVID-19 pounds that you might have gained. So we've seen changes in eating habits and physical activity and tobacco use, alcohol consumption. And we've also seen a decrease in the use of preventive and emergency healthcare services. 4 in 10 Americans who were surveyed in this June 2020 reported delaying or avoiding medical care. So we know there's going to be a big backlog of critical chronic disease care that is going to have to be addressed as we come out of this pandemic. We've got to really understand all of those issues to really be able to prepare for the post-pandemic period of time. And as the science evolves, we're also going to get a better understanding of this long-term COVID and what that looks like, and whether people with chronic disease were at a higher risk for those types of conditions. So similar to what you said, a lot going on as we begin to come out of the pandemic and understand the impact of COVID-19 on chronic disease.
Yeah, Good Day certainly saw the impact on the chronic disease community that we service. So many being over 65, fear of going to their doctor, so delaying doctor appointments. We also saw an increased need of just financial support to help with daily things like food, rent, utilities. And then again, me personally, I had 3 close people pass away that had underlying conditions as well.
I'm so sorry. My condolences.
Thank you. And we're certainly all learning. So again, thank you for what you're doing in providing us education so we can, make better programs and help the people that we're all serving. So leading into that, what does the future of chronic disease look like?
Well, I'd already talked a little bit about where we think the pandemic has impacted chronic disease, which certainly one of the things we've seen is that it has just revealed the existing health disparities across the nation. We knew these existed before, but I'm not sure the general public was as aware as they are now. So going forward, we've got to amplify our existing efforts and make sure that these individuals who have been historically underserved or marginalized, who have often great distrust in healthcare and in public health, that they can build back that trust, build new trust, and receive the care that they so richly deserve. But we also know that there's going to be innovative technologies coming out of this, new ways of collecting data. We know that people are going to hopefully be able to manage their chronic diseases with new data, biometric data, which is certainly growing in popularity. We don't quite know how that's going to develop in the future, but we're hopeful that these will help individuals track their own diseases. Their physicians and their other clinicians help them manage and prevent their diseases. And along those lines, in order to really understand where things are going with chronic disease at the local level, people need access to data. And chronic disease data is often hard to get because they're not reportable conditions like infectious diseases. So to that end, we have something called PLACES, which is called Population Level Analysis and Community Estimates. And it's the first of its kind effort to make available local area health information across the entire United States. It includes estimates for smaller cities, rural areas that was not previously available. And it should enable individuals who are trying to understand what's going on in their communities to make better decisions because they have access to this data. It's based on our behavioral risk factor surveillance system, and we've used something called small area analysis to get it down to that level. We know that in order to face chronic disease as we move into the future and have this opportunity before us, that we've got to work together across jurisdictions, across sectors, and we've got to focus on it in a new way so that we can move the needle on health equity.
I'm 100%, that's certainly part of our mission. And, when we look at community isn't just our area. It's our nation. And we need to continue. And again, thank you for everything that the CDC is doing, as we definitely use that data to try to gain a better understanding of what the needs are, so we can develop programs that will effectively help the lives that we're trying to serve. So thank you so much again for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Hope this was helpful and great to hear about your good work.
Hello, Chronic Disease Day. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dane Christensen, I'm Executive Vice President at the Health and Medicine Council of Washington, and I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker this year. Personally, I just want to say hearing the patient stories, being part of this event is always such a humbling experience. And it's even more humbling watching this event and the community grow more involved, more impressive, and more impactful year over year. If you're interested in the work that's going on at CDC and the Chronic Disease Center or at NIH and the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, please join us for the advocacy stream. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, where we're going to talk about how advocates across the country can lend their voice to make a timely impact for these programs. Through my work with groups like the Pulmonary Hypertension Association and the American Lung Association, I've known our keynote speaker, Dr. Gibbons, for many years, and I've known the good work that he does and that NHLBI has done. It's always quite impressive. I'm sure he has an outstanding update for us. We're honored to have the director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at NIH, Dr. Gary Gibbons, with us today. He's been the director of the Institute since 2012 and is a tremendous wealth of resource, of knowledge and information. Along with Dr. Fauci at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NHLBI has really been playing the leading role in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and studying COVID as a chronic illness. As the name suggests, NHLBI is focused on advancing the research portfolios into heart, lung, blood, and sleep, and also the portfolios, of course, in a variety of different chronic conditions. Before joining NHLBI, Dr. Gibbons served as the founding director of the Cardiovascular Research Institute, chairperson of the Department of Physiology, and professor of physiology and medicine at the Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Gibbons, thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope Chronic Disease Day joins me in welcoming you. Thank you very much.
Well, hopefully you can hear me okay, Dane. I really appreciate this opportunity, and again, commendations to the organizers for putting this together. It's our pleasure to participate. And hopefully we can share what has been our NIH response. If I could have my first slide. What I've tried to prepare in response to this invitation is really how critically important it is to address chronic disease as part of the NIH response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in accordance with your group, we've tried to focus this short presentation on that intersection between chronic disease, that's a critical part of our portfolio at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as well as our vanguard role in the NIH response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. In that regard, I'm sure this audience is well aware that the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute has some of the major chronic disorders in our portfolio as part of our mission to prevent and treat, if not cure. And that includes the #1 killer of men and women in the US, heart disease, chronic lung diseases, and chronic blood disorders. And so we are quite familiar with the critical role of chronic diseases in promoting disability and death in this country, and see it as our highest priority to see we can develop innovative pathways and strategies to better prevent and hopefully preempt and cure many of these chronic diseases in our portfolio. On the left, we're just illustrating actually one of what we think has been a success story over the last 50 years, in which there's been over a 70% decline in cardiovascular disease death rates in the US. And that's been a testimony to advances in science and public health practice, such as smoking cessation, a host of new cardiovascular therapeutic drugs that have reduced the incidence of heart failure and heart attacks, and that's led to that reduction. But we also know that that decline over the last several decades actually appears to be plateauing, and in fact, in certain communities is actually going in the wrong direction. So we have some unfinished business. And on the left, you can see some of the, at a county level of resolution, where we're still having challenges with high rates of cardiovascular mortality. And you can see in that red zone, almost that Ohio River Valley that goes West Virginia and Kentucky down the Mississippi River Valley, and then stretching into the southeast as really the hot spots of the greatest cardiovascular disease burden in our country. And it reinforces the notion that although there are a variety of individual factors, genetic predispositions that predispose to cardiovascular disease, a lot of it is driven by risk factors, such as smoking or physical inactivity or obesity. And what we've also observed is that these same risk factors are shown on the right that predispose to chronic diseases like heart disease also have certain geographic patterns. And in fact, if I were to show you a map of the highest rates of obesity or diabetes or high blood pressure or indeed smoking, it would align with that same cardiovascular disease mortality map with some of those same hotspots. And in many ways, this aligns with actually the previous speaker, Dr. Hacker, in which she was describing the various factors that determine chronic disease that include what we call the social determinants of health. And this notion that, as titled here, place matters. Where you live and grow and work and play has an influence on your cardiovascular health. Similarly, we now know that although we think about heart disease as a quote unquote disease of aging, in fact, that process starts probably in utero. So we often think of this as heart disease as a disease of the elderly, but we learn now that the trajectory for developing a heart attack in your 60s may actually begin in your teenage years. And so that really reinforces how important it is to engage in preventive strategies that build the resilience necessary to promote greater cardiovascular health and prevent the complications like heart attacks and strokes. Next slide, please. So that's the framework of chronic disease and the risk factors for chronic disease. And what we're seeing in the context of this historic pandemic is, again, this intersection between risk of chronic disease, the presence of comorbid chronic disease conditions, and your risk of developing COVID-19 and its complications. Indeed, what we've learned over this last year and a half is that many pre-existing chronic diseases increase the risk of severe COVID-19 complications. And so many of those same factors that I showed you on the prior slide that predispose to cardiovascular disease and promote it are also seen amongst patients who are hospitalized with severe COVID. As shown in the right-hand panel, you can see a lot of those chronic disease conditions are prevalent as comorbid states, pre-existing conditions prior to infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the development of COVID-19 disease. And so you can see that chronic disease influences the trajectory and clinical course of COVID-19. So those underlying health conditions increase the risk for severe COVID-associated disease, hospitalizations, and deaths. And that's where this intersection is so important. Next slide, please. In that regard, over the last year and a half, some may wonder why it was mentioned that we work closely with Dr. Tony Fauci, obviously an infectious disease expert. Some wonder why the NHLBI is playing such a lead role in the NIH response to COVID-19. And it really goes back to the virus. This is a virus that moves by the aerosols that it flies around in, and therefore is a respiratory virus. It is inhaled, and that's how it spreads from person to person. It becomes contagious. And so the first site that it lands in is the lung as part of our portfolio. And it attacks the lung and promotes lung injury, causing the pneumonias and other complications. It also attacks the heart, and it attacks the blood systems. So each part of our portfolio is really a target of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And indeed, it manifests itself in the clinical presentation and spectrum of the disease. So COVID-19 can quickly progress from mild to severe. And again, that relates to its impact on vital organs like the heart, the lung, and the blood systems. Moreover, your body activates its immune system, its body's defense to fight off the virus, hopefully kill it and eliminate it. And so as that immune system gets activated, the whole body is on an alarm basis. And there's a prompt inflammatory response attacking the virus. Unfortunately, as the body's defense system attacks the virus, it can also promote injury to the tissues where the virus is hiding and replicating and reproducing itself. And so again, the tissue injury that results from the viral infection affects the lungs, the heart, and blood systems. As a result, you see as a sequelae, a consequence of SARS-CoV-2 infection and COVID-19, that there is virus-induced damage to the various organs like the heart, lung, and indeed, it seems like almost every organ of the body can be affected by infection with SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. Some of this may relate to the fact that a key target for the virus is actually the lining of the blood vessels. And the blood vessels, by definition, go to every part of your body, every organ. And so by attacking the lining of that blood vessel, the endothelium, that may explain a lot about the multi-organ complications of severe COVID, and indeed how it may intersect with chronic disease. So a critical question that came right out of the box last March was how could the NHLBI portfolio and assets, research platforms, and investigator community be mobilized very quickly to try to develop therapeutic strategies, often using drugs that need to be repurposed in order to see what we could do to prevent or better treat these patients with COVID-19 that had injury to their heart, lung, and blood systems. Next slide, please. Toward that end, one of the clear early manifestations that clinicians were observing last year involved how the virus was affecting various host systems, the body systems. Now, clearly, the main target was going to be to give therapeutic drugs that would go after the virus directly, antiviral strategies. But what we also concentrated on in the NHLBI was how the body responds, how the host responds to the invasion by the virus. And a key part of the complications was the blood clots. And so we developed master protocols by engaging our investigator community and developed various strategies and treatment approaches to try to prevent these blood clots, whether they occurred in the outpatient basis, in the hospital, or even post-hospitalization convalescence. And we've already gained new insights in that regard. One of our trials has demonstrated that by giving a blood thinner in the inpatient setting, you could actually reduce these complications and enhance recovery. And so we still have studies underway to see how we can better extend that observation and prevent this complications. Similarly, as the virus attacks the various organ tissues and creates injury, we also have investigators who are developing medication strategies to enhance the repair, the intrinsic reparative capacity of these organs to withstand insults like a viral infection and heal. And so those trials are underway as well. As I alluded to, a key part of how the virus does damage is that it induces an immune response, the response of the body's defense system to eliminate this foreigner, this microbe, this virus. And sometimes that becomes hyperactive or overexuberant. And as I say, can also actually injure the tissues even more. And so how do we modulate that response? And so trials are underway to see whether there are certain anti-inflammatory or immune modulatory drugs that can be added to enhance recovery and mitigate complications. One of the strategies to attack the virus is to leverage the generation of antibodies directed against the virus. Now, everybody who's infected with this, who mounts an immune response, develops those antibodies to attack the virus. If they have successfully recovered from SARS-CoV-2 infection and COVID, they have antibodies in their body, and that can be harvested in their what's called convalescent plasma. Those antibodies can be extracted from their blood since they've successfully recovered and given back to patients. That's an approach that's been done for actually decades, if not 100 years. And it was thought that that might be helpful in COVID-19. Well, our institute tested that very early on to see if convalescent plasma could prevent the progression of COVID-19. And it was an important study that was released very recently in which it was demonstrated that convalescent plasma actually did not confer a significant benefit in changing the clinical course of COVID-19. And so it was really important when we do clinical research and do trials to find out what doesn't work as it is important to find out what does work. And so we now know that certain interventions like convalescent plasma aren't the most useful approach. And what really does work in this context are what are called monoclonal antibodies. Those that are antibodies that are manufactured in high quantities to target the virus and stop it. And so that's what we've learned over the last year and a half as part of the NIH response to COVID related to new therapies. And all of these are giving us important insights into not only how to end the pandemic and enhance recovery, reduce complications, reduce progression of COVID-19, but also how to enhance the ability of those with chronic disorders to more effectively be resilient against the damaging effects of the virus. Next slide, please. Another key part is to understand the clinical spectrum of COVID. And many of you are aware that it appears to have a different sort of presentation among children. One thing that is emerged that's relevant to this intersection of COVID-19 and chronic disease is the development of what's called the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, or MIS-C. This is associated with SARS-CoV-2 infection, but it's notable that this is something that appears about 3 to 4 to 5 weeks after that infection, and after maybe even the virus has been removed from the body, but where that a hyperactive immune system creates organ dysfunction. And the children can get pretty sick, requiring hospitalization, often requiring ICU care. With good supportive care, they typically recover. But one of the unknown questions is whether there are chronic long-term sequelae of this MIS-C syndrome. And this is an active area of investigation. What we can do to predict which children are most at risk for developing this problem, which is often about 1 out of 3,000 children, and what we can do to accelerate or mitigate the long-term implications. Next slide. In addition to the MIS-C syndrome in children, another intersection of chronic disease and COVID is what's called long COVID. Some of these patients call themselves long haulers. These are individuals who may experience acute SARS-CoV-2 infection, maybe even develop just mild symptoms of COVID-19, might not even require hospitalization, but they notice and develop very persistent symptoms that go on long after the virus is often cleared from their nasopharynx or from their blood. And so they often complain of constitutional symptoms like fatigue and a number of neuropsychological complications like sleep disturbances, difficulties sleeping, cognitive dysfunction, often called brain fog. They may have cardiopulmonary issues of palpitations, difficulty breathing, a variety of multi-organ complications in this long COVID. And again, this is one of those intersections where we want to understand how does this acute viral infection lead to some of these longer term effects after the acute episode is over? Who's at risk? And again, what can be done to prevent or mitigate it? Next slide. As shown here, these are some of the symptoms in long COVID, and we're still trying to characterize the full spectrum of this novel disorder. And you can see from this table that many of the symptoms that people present with an acute COVID actually do wane over a 3 to 6 month period. But as you can see there in the blue, there's another set of symptoms that just don't seem to go away, or at least seem to persist, again, often involving these constitutional symptoms of breathlessness and fatigue, and neuropsychiatric feelings of anxiety and depression, etc. Next slide, please. And so as part of the NIH response, we've recently launched a program that's funded at about $1 billion from Congress to understand the impact of long COVID by researching COVID to enhance recovery. We call this the Recover Study. It has a couple of objectives, really, to understand, treat, and prevent long COVID by understanding how frequently it happens, what the risk factors for who gets it, and again, importantly, what we can do about it, how we can prevent it or treat it more effectively. And it all begins with creating this recovery cohort where we can systematically study people who have acute COVID and then see who develops long COVID as a result. And with careful evaluation by multidisciplinary teams, really understand this a new sort of chronic consequence of COVID in a way that we can, again, have insights to how to better prevent and treat it. Next slide, please. And so a key part, and finally, of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been to, again, address some of the social determinants of health, and again, how place matters, not only in chronic disease, but in COVID-19. And we recognize that the problems with COVID-19, the pandemic, again, are not evenly distributed across our country. There are certain groups that have been disproportionately affected, and particularly there's this interplay between clinical features like having chronic diseases and the social determinants of health, in which there's a convergence that particularly exacerbates or magnifies racial disparities in both chronic disease and COVID-19 as part of that intersection. And so communities of color, whether it's African American, Hispanic, or American Indian, tend to have higher prevalence of chronic diseases like obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, as well as often in occupations with high exposure, whether it's hospitality industry, transportation industry, and may have challenges and barriers related to access to mitigation strategies, testing, treatments, and vaccines. And all of these things may predispose to higher rates of hospitalizations and deaths in these same communities as shown on the right. Next slide, please. So, and again, this will be our last example. What we're seeing across the country, this is a map showing you the latest pattern of percentages of fully vaccinated residents. And you can see the lighter colors are where we don't have as good a vaccination rate as we would like. Notably, that's also where we had some of the highest concentrations of cases as well in hospitalizations, particularly over last summer. And these are hotspots. Many of these same hotspots have communities, and particularly communities of color, that have even more challenging rates of both disease burden and challenges related to vaccine access. And this is something that the NIH recognized very early on, that it was critically important to expand our frontline partnerships as part of an NIH Community Engagement Alliance against COVID-19 disparities. We started, therefore, the SEAL program last summer, where we strategically targeted these same states that are shown there with a yellow star, and hopefully appropriately, those are aligned with where we anticipated there may be issues related to health disparities, both for chronic disease as well as COVID. And we've marshaled researchers in these entities, 20 across the country now, that have developed local coalitions of academic partners, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, health systems, minority-serving institutions, all the assets at the community level to mobilize and promote education, collaboration, inclusive participation in ways that can help those communities be more resilient and protected against the pandemic. Next slide, please. Toward that end, that strategy is involved addressing COVID-19 disparities by creating a community of practice through partnerships. I won't dwell on these various specifics, but each of these SEAL teams has been working with local partners to develop local solutions, whether it's pop-up testing or pop-up vaccination centers, going door to door for education and other town halls related to communication to address misinformation, as well as promoting understanding and confidence in science, as well as the uptake of benefits of science, such as vaccine. Next slide, please. Toward this end, we see some encouraging progress with regard to some of the hesitancy that we saw last summer and fall, particularly amongst the African American community, where quite frankly, only a minority of African Americans expressed any interest in taking the vaccine, even if it was proven safe and effective. And with this concerted multi-level effort across the country to address mistrust and misinformation, we're encouraged that that tide is starting to turn in some of those attitudes, particularly amongst African Americans in most recent surveys. And we're seeing promising directions with the gradual increase in vaccine rate uptake as well. Next slide, please. Over these last few weeks, toward that end, this is a sort of deeper dive into two states or entities, District of Columbia and California, where you can see some of the challenges that remain in terms of racial ethnic disparities, in which you can see in District of Columbia, the relatively solid rate of vaccine rate amongst whites, particularly relative to what they are in the population, as you can see, 52 to 41, and certainly in proportion to the relatively lower prevalence of cases and deaths. In contrast, you can see the blacks on the right have a lower rate of vaccination rates relative to their population, and much lower than the rate of deaths and cases. Similarly, in California, you can see a similar pattern where whites exceed that of Hispanics, again, relative to their caseload and hospitalizations and death rates, and proportion in the population. So we still have work to do to close these racial ethnic gaps in vaccination. Next slide, please. So what I've tried to indicate to you today is how we're addressing this intersection between chronic disease and gaining insights, actually, from the COVID-19 pandemic, and quite frankly, vice versa. We're addressing COVID-19, given our understanding of chronic diseases, is influencing therapeutic strategies. All of this is involved, again, how science is trying to understand and characterize both of these conditions, both long COVID and the impact on chronic disease, as well as to do it in the frame of engagement of communities and patients as partners as we address these public health challenges and address and develop an evidence-based elimination of these health disparities. In many ways, I believe what we will learn out of this pandemic are ways to promote better prevention and resilience against these intersections of both chronic disease and these acute insults, such as those presented by COVID-19. Next slide. I'd like to thank you for your attention and appreciate the collaborative partnership with which we fulfill our mission to turn discovery centers into the health of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbons, for taking the time to be with us today, and to NIH for educating our communities on risk factors of chronic illness and the role we all play to become a healthier society. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, well, I hope everyone enjoyed today's live stream as much as I have, and thank you for watching with us. The challenges we face when it comes to chronic illness and access to care are not easily solved. Although we recognize Chronic Disease Day in July, Our work to lower the number continues throughout the year. Please join Good Days tomorrow at the same time for a special Facebook Live advocacy training session on how you can use your voice to engage lawmakers and make a difference with us. Look out for more events to come at chronicdiseaseday.org. Thank you again and have a great day.